Muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm excited to be in conversation with all of you. I come to this work as the daughter of parents from Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Puerto Rico. And for me, it was the early noticing of health disparities in my community, within my family, translating from my abuela at a young age because there were no interpreters, at the from her primary care doctor to any hospital needs, and then just noticing the numerous health needs and struggles of family in New York, in Puerto Rico, in Dominican Republic. All of this coupled with the realities of the reproductive health issues that every one of my tias, primas, mom, and I faced at various stages of our lives. So, unfortunately, fainting at the sight of blood kept me from the medical, uh, from medical studies. So I began to study politics and health policy at the intersection of race and class. And it was while serving as an administrator and teaching a few classes as an adjunct that I learned about the reproductive justice framework. And it was a framework that just spoke to me and my family and what I knew to be a path forward for us to get to wellness, for us to thrive. And so after landing at the La National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice, I was drawn to Forward Together because of their combination, or their very intentional combining and bringing together of the RJ framework and a framework for expansive family, right? And ensuring that our families can all thrive. And so I'm a movement strategist who is committed to ensuring that our communities can and will see themselves into the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I mean, I love this because I see so many different points here. And one of the things that I'm seeing is like the way that each of you has been acting as like a path maker, right? Like kind of opening those doors, trying to like make moves, but bring your family, your community, and other folks with you into this. And I find so many resonances with my own experiences, right? I was also a translator, for my parents at the doctor's office, at the welfare office, even for my brothers and sisters who were in school and got in trouble. I was the one in the principal's office snitching, you know what I'm saying, by mistake. I was just translating. But that becomes really important. But I also remember, Michelle, when you talked about, going to the emergency room as medical care, as primary medical care, you just shocked me back into the memory of, if you're really, really sick, put on your best dress, put on your best socks and your best shoes and your best coat. We're going to the emergency room to go see the doctor because that's all we had available to us, right? And so there are all these ways, right? Like for us to capture these experiences, right? And also, Sonia, when you're talking about like, I wanted to dance and I wanted to do art, and your mother was like, well, that's real cute for you, but what you got to do is catch one of these 3 degrees. All these experiences, they're so rich and they're so diverse, and yet we have so much relation across them, right? Across these experiences. But we know that, like, although we have that, and Magda just opened up by saying there's 200 to 250 million of us, Afro-descendientes, right? Here in the first diaspora, not to mention the multiple diasporas afterwards. And so much of our experiences are not captured. They're not captured by the data, right? And if there is data on Hispanic communities or Black communities, they're not disaggregated so that we know what the Afro-Latina or Afro-Latinx or Afro-Latina experiences are. What do we do? How do we quantify, right? How does, like, I guess in your fields, because they're all so different, but they have these intersections. How does the question of like data, the numbers, the kind of proof that the Western epistemology wants to have, like, how does that like fall into the lap of your work? And how do you deal with that, right? And where does data and the numbers, how does that affect what you do?
I'll start with that because that is, as an academic, our narratives and our stories are never enough because they're always seen as anecdotal information. And so being able to pull data, to substantiate what we already know. It's like, okay, you need to see numbers. Here are the numbers. It's sort of like, just this extra hoop that we have to jump through to legitimize the needs in our community, or to legitimize, the points that we're trying to make. And I learned that very early, in graduate school. My dissertation was a qualitative dissertation, and I was getting pushback. And I said, okay, I'll give you data, but this is a narrative. This is about a story that needs to be told. And so I use data to get the attention of those that will look at our narratives and our stories as just being anecdotal. I'm putting quotation marks in the air, because we know what we know, and we know that our experiences are legitimate. And so, it's like my mother always says, you have to be double good. You have to be double knowledgeable. You have to, be extra, extra, extra. So, I think the data is really substantiates what we already know, and substantiates the information that we come to the table with.
In healthcare, we don't have much data when it comes to any Hispanic broken down by, are you Afro-Latino or not? Unfortunately, we're looked at as Hispanics. You're non-Black, non-Hispanic Black, or non-Hispanic white, and Hispanic is just homogenous, which we're not. And I think that's something that I struggled with when I came from Puerto Rico. I grew up in Puerto Rico for my first few years, and I came here at the age of 10, and I didn't look like any of the other Latinos around me. And that has always been the case because everyone else is fair skin, straight hair. I had the darker skin, I had the curly hair. So I did not feel that I fit with most of the Latinos. I fit with the African American population because that's who I look like. I was always questioned whether I was Latina. So it doesn't surprise me that there isn't enough information because there isn't that awareness that there are differences, although you would think it is obvious. I had the honor of preparing a lecture for our system at Health and Hospitals on what is Hispanic, Latina, Latinx. And I took that as an opportunity to try to teach about we're not all the same. And I try to break down some of the history in a very short period of time, but give a broad overview. We don't just speak Spanish. There's so many other languages that we speak in Latin America. We come from African descent, and there's so many indigenous populations. And although we may look similar, we have very different histories, and that shapes who we are. So I was really happy to have that opportunity because I also learned a lot myself. But I think there's so much work that has to be done in the healthcare field to dig into what are the differences. We see a lot of disparity with maternal fetal health, and is that the same for the Afro-Latina woman as it is for the Black woman, as it is for the non-Black Latinos? So we don't know. That information is not available.
Absolutely. And I would love to give some love to my comrades at the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice, who recently did a report called The State Abortion Bans Threatens threatens 6.7 million Latinas, largest group of women of color living under bans. And in this report, they disaggregated the data. And it was beautiful. And it was the first report of its kind that I've seen in reproductive justice, in reproductive health rights and justice, honestly, in the three sectors. And it disaggregated the data by Black Latinas, Native Latinas, API Latinas, those who identified as multiracial, et cetera. And it painted the picture of what we often assume, right? Because if we're looking at intersectionality and multiple oppressions, right, we know that the folks that are, who are the folks that are most likely to lack access to care, the full spectrum of care, right? Abortion care, as a form of healthcare, general healthcare, right? And who are most targeted for different types of oppression, right? Incarceration, deportation, etc. But this report really highlights and tells the story of how Black Latinas are disproportionately impacted, right? And how, and then from folks that identified as multiracial, also that's a population that is very much impacted by the lack of access to reproductive health care. So there are those bright spots, and I just wanted to highlight that one. And another bright spot to highlight is the work around immigration. And here I'd like to shout out our comrades at the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, BAJI. They've done various reports on the state of immigration, and they've been very clear on naming where folks are coming from, what countries folks are coming from. When they talk about Black immigrants, who are they referring to, right? And that is very intentional. Of course, it is to counter the image, you know. Sonia, you spoke about culture and art. What we see from the dominant narrative and dominant culture, the who is put forward as an immigrant is not a Black immigrant typically, right? And Black immigrants are disproportionately deported, disproportionately detained, right? And disproportionately face violence. And they have several reports that talk to this topic, and the state of Black immigrants, uncovering the truth. And also then they've done another recent report, then layering in a queer and trans lens, and what that means for immigrants and Black immigrants, thinking about queer and trans folks and how they're detained, where they're detained if you're a trans person, and then the denial of gender affirming care, right? So there are some bright spots, but of course it's organizations that aren't mainstream, right? So it's on all of us to come together, do some movement building and movement strategy so we can push those that have the larger access to tools and resources to change that.
No, this is really incredible. I mean, I'm thinking you guys have like really got me thinking about some experiences. And, you know, when I was an undergrad, I was a medical interpreter at a clinic. It was a clinic that was a feeder from the Robert Wood Johnson Clinic, because I went to Rutgers, New Brunswick. And so I, you know, like maybe my sophomore year of college, they were like, oh, they need medical interpreters. And I was like, oh, I have so much experience, right? So I was like, I'll do it. And they were really serving both undocumented, like Mexican and Central American populations, as well as undocumented Dominican populations. Primarily, those are the patients going there. But what was really interesting is that, you know, because they were all seen as like Spanish speakers, right? There wasn't really a sense of a difference with how the doctors or the residents were treating them. So when a Mexican family would come in and the child would have a stomach ache or something like that, they would be like, okay, tell them not to eat so many tortillas, right? And I'm like, oh, okay, well, el doctor dice, you know, whatever. I once had a Dominican family come in with a young son who had a stomach problem. And the doctor like looks up and he's like, okay, tell them not to give him so many tortillas, right? And I was like, oh, doctor, like sidebar, you know, not allowed to do that. But I'm like, sidebar, doctor, well, they're Dominican, so they don't eat tortillas. You know what I mean? That's not part of their food. And he was like, tell them I said to stop feeding him so many tortillas. And I was like, wow, like, this is really incredible. Like this is like, you don't even see the difference, right? Like it not only, I mean, it just astounds, right? Because I'm sure that if they didn't speak Spanish, he wouldn't have known the difference, right? But because they speak Spanish, then they must be with the Central Americans or with the Mexican population, because there's no other way. He couldn't really like fathom what that looked like, right? And it was really angering, it was really enraging in that moment to try to figure out, like, I'm not only an interpreter, and as an interpreter, you're trained to just be, right? Like you have to be really clear, there's a boundary, you can't advocate. And I knew that I was like, I will, you know, I continued to work there and I tried to the best I could of, you know, 19 years old, but still knowing like this is a fundamental problem. The other thing is the question of, and Diana, thank you so much for bringing up, right? The National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice and their like moves towards trying to calculate, right? what this looks like, quantify, the impact that this has on our community, something that we know. And oftentimes our subjective experiences are seen like, oh, ustedes están, tienen complejo, you guys are making it up, and, nosotros no vemos color, aquí no hay negro, aquí no hay, right? Like, todos somos los mismos, ustedes son una compleja, all this other stuff, right? Like, all of these things that is like insults like your consciousness and insults like your intelligence and your experiences. And it's really frustrating to know that. But then the other thing with the data is like, who's taking in the data? I remember when I was buying my first house, when I was, first got my job as a professor, got a house. And I remember I corrected on the forms. They would put like Black, not Hispanic. And I was like, no, I'm Black and I'm Puerto Rican. And I would fix it and I would get the form back and they would take it away, right? And it's like I never did it. And the same thing when I went to the doctor, right? I would go to the doctor, you go to the new doctor, you go in and you're like, Black, Puerto Rican. And they're like, okay, Black, not Hispanic. And I'm like, no, I'm Black, I'm Puerto Rican, right? I'm a Black Puerto Rican. And I remember oftentimes they'd be like, oh, that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter, right? Like, don't worry about that. And I'm like, but I am worried about that because someone's going to capture that somewhere, right? And this experience is going to get lost if you don't capture it. And we know this from experience, right? We know this from the kinds of the archive that we see, the census documents, right? The project that I'm working on now is reaching back all the way to the 19th century and looking at my own family documents and the way that my very Black family gets whitened over the course of time, from negro to mulatto to colored. And then my father, a Black Puerto Rican man, on his death certificate gets marked as white, right? So over the course of 80 years of his lifetime, he goes from being born as un negro, un mulatto, right, to being then white. And so then if we go just by the person who takes the census, the random person who's saying like, oh, well, this name is Spanish, so he can't be Black, right? What do we do, right? Like, where is, and I guess this is where I'm going to, like, how do we contend, right, with that very disorienting feeling, right, with that like very violent structure that erases us from our very own experiences, right? And how do we understand equity, right? How do we understand justice within this context? What has been your experiences in this?
That's powerful, and a lot to really think about, because very often we are only seen as what we look like. You are what you look like, and that's it. You cannot be Latina. Very often they hear my name, they don't know who I am. They've just seen my name. I've heard they thought I was a man. They thought I was white. I was like, no, I am a woman. I am Latina. Um, and that's unfortunate because
Not
we
them
have
thinking you're French, like, oh, Michelle said so, yeah.
no, not that. They never went to the French side, unfortunately. And we have so many parts to us. We're not just one thing. It makes us richer being so complex. I have to say, when I was a resident, I made a very, well, actually, when I was a medical student, I made a very conscious choice to stop relaxing my hair. It was really a lack of time. I didn't have time to be going to the salon, spending 2 hours under the hair dryer. I didn't have the time. I didn't have the money. And in 1995, I decided to go natural. And through my residency programs, when I was going for my interviews, everybody was wondering, am I going to straighten my hair? I said, no, you're going to see who I am. I'm going to go with curly hair because this is who you're going to see the entire time. It may have impacted where I went, because I wasn't seen like I would fit in. But for me, that didn't matter because I needed to be true to who I was. And that's something that I continue to try to represent at every stage of my career, making sure that they know this is who I am. And I come with a lot of history behind me. There's a lot of rich culture that you cannot just dismiss. There are a lot of disparities that we have to go through, unfortunately, because we don't have always access to information. We don't have access to the care. We don't have access to housing and education. I was told, I was having a conversation with a pharmacist on the phone, and he said, "Oh my God, wow, you speak English so well." And I chose to stay quiet because I didn't want the other side to come out, because I'm thinking, so I'm a doctor and you think because of my name I'm not supposed to speak well. And one very telling and scary experience that I had as a resident, I was speaking to a patient in Spanish. I interviewed for a whole hour in Spanish, and Puerto Rican woman, white, she said, "Oh my God, you speak Spanish so well, and your hair is so curly." I turned around and I didn't want to be disrespectful because I couldn't. I had to walk away. And I said, wow, my own people are doing this to me. In her eyes, I could not be a fellow Puerto Rican. And that is part of, I think, for me, the issue that we're facing today.
Yeah, I just want to chime in off of that because, Maya, when you ask, what does equity look like, and your experience, Michelle, equity is, the ability for us to be seen and recognized as who we are, our Afro-Latina-ness, and with our beautiful skin, with our curly hair, English is my first language. So when my parents came here, they were learning English. So they wanted their children to learn English first. And what I find so interesting is that I'm always, usually by white folks, will say, oh, you're so articulate and you speak English so well. It's like, well, English is my language. And why wouldn't I be articulate? So there's this this mythology that white Americans hold, that when we step forward as who we are, as Latinas, as Afro-Latinas, then there are all of these assumptions that get initially made, even when they know. I mean, I've had these comments come from people that know me and have worked with me for years and are still saying, oh, you're so articulate and you speak. Why wouldn't I speak English well? My mother speaks perfect English, and that's not her first language, And so equity is really having the ability to walk through life, not always having to explain ourselves, not always having to be nice. I'm going to be nice. I'm not going to go there, because sometimes we need to go there. We need to shake it up. We need to shake folks up so that they hear us and that they understand, who we are and where we're coming from.
Absolutely. I appreciate you naming all of that. And the number of times that I've been on a panel in repro health, rights, and justice spaces, and a white counterpart has said, "You're always so articulate, Diana." I'm like, oh, bye. Right. And it's just that perpetuation of that narrative, right? Going back to storytelling and cultural strategy. And I firmly believe that this element of data and what story does the data tell, it's on folks like us. It's on organizers and educators, right, like us, that are going to push the envelope and run our own studies, right? Run our own studies, start to really ensure that we're telling the story of the multiple identities that we hold, and ensuring that folks know we exist, and that our existence is seen and heard, right? Some of the things, the continuity of, well, there's no data on that, right? And the aggregation of data, right? Like even when we're looking at election polling, right? And it's like, this is how Black folks voted. This is how the Latino community voted. We don't know what that actually tells us. What story does that tell us versus the story that the dominant media is trying to tell, right? the narrative that they're trying to push in terms of where folks are along the political spectrum, right? It's by design, surely. And even in our scope of work as Forward Together, we're partnering with comrades that are ready and willing to collaborate with us and co-conspire around data in reproductive health. And oftentimes the data is very centered around cis women, right? Yet we know that gender expensive folks also need and do access and seek reproductive health care, right? So it's kind of like that institutionalized invisibilization of folks that live at the margins. And it's up to, organizers that are ready to tell our collective story for our collective liberation, to push that and create our own cultural intervention, cultural products, tell our own stories, and write ourselves, paint ourselves, narrate ourselves into existence and into the future.
I mean, I think, it's so powerful here, like the cross section of experiences, right? Sonia, when you talk about English being your first language, Spanish is my first language, even though I was born here, right? But en casa se habla español, and that was it. And my parents been here. My father's now passed away, but my mother has been here since she's like 17 years old, and still does not speak English. Grew up in a Puerto Rican barrio where she didn't need to, right? And so we have these kinds of different experiences, even within our shared experience of being Black Latinas, right? Caribeñas and, and beyond. And then, Michelle, I could like, feel in my bones, like that moment of like feeling so disrespected, right? And feeling so dismissed by someone in the community that you like stepped in, did all this training, did all this schooling, wanting to advocate for your community. And then they're standing right in front of you and they're like, oh, interesting. Look at you. You're cute little Spanish and your hair all curly, con ese pelo malo que tú tienes, profesional aquí, and you're like, damn it, if I didn't love this community so much, I would meet me outside. Meet me outside now. But I think it's like, it's that feeling, right? Like that moment where you become deselected. You get taken out of your own identity in your community. I was in Puerto Rico a few years ago, and I was with the writer and professor Mayra Santos Febres, and we were in Arecibo, standing outside of a cafe. We were doing like a cultural event. And a woman comes up to us, a white Puerto Rican comes up to us. Me and Mayra are just talking. And this woman comes up to us and she's like, y ustedes son de Loíza, And me and Mayra turn around and we know exactly where that comes from, right? This idea that Blackness in Puerto Rico can only come from this place, right? And we both turn around to her and we're like, actually, no, we're not from Loíza. She's from Carolina and I'm from Caguas and Vega Baja. Like, what's the next question? Like, what is it? Like, it's just so frustrating, right? Or that feeling when, when I'm in the United States, people walk up to me, they might talk to me in Spanish because they can see you, right? They can kind of, nena, ven acá, permiso, whatever. When I'm in Puerto Rico, the first reaction of people is to talk to me in English, right? And I'm like, but why? I can speak Spanish perfectly, right? So there's this thing, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that kind of when you're talking about the end of the strategy, Sonia, you're talking about the strategy, Michelle, you're talking about the strategy of how do we respond to this? And there's a different strategy that y'all are talking about. Sonia's like, y'all gonna hear it right now, right? And Michelle is like, let me think about a different way to approach this. And I'm thinking about that as like the multiple strategies that we have to take up. We each have to enact different ways to do this. Because again, we're talking about path making, right? We're talking about like, if Michelle walls out on her patient, as she has every right to do, what happens to the residents? What happens to the other folks who she's trying to make a path for, right? And so I'm thinking like we all gotta get in where we fit in, and we gotta figure out how we do this so that we don't mess up the path for the person behind us. So we need the Sonia, we need the Michelle, we need the Dana, we need all of this, right? All of these strategies together so that we can continue to make the path while somebody's being like, not too fast on that one, right? Not too much on this. So that's key.
Mayra, if I can interject, I mean, the other piece to it, if I went off on someone, I would automatically be labeled because that is what they were
Eso
expecting.
mismo. Eso
Because I'm
mismo.
the spicy Latina, because I am, the angry Black woman.
Mhm.
That's why.
Mhm.
Um, I remember an instance where there was a young Black woman who had multiple seizures, and she had been admitted. And one of the medical students, white medical student, interviewed her, and he came to me to report the case. He said, "Oh, she had low educational attainment." I'm like, "Wait, what do you mean? What are you talking about?" She was confused. I said, "You know what? I could have understood if you told me that she's confused because you woke her up in the middle of the night to ask her a million questions, or because she just finished having 4 seizures back to back and she has a right to be confused. But don't tell me that crap that it's because she has low educational attainment." So he went and complained to his white resident. Now he knew me very well. We were classmates. So he turned around, he said, "What did you do to Michelle? Because for Michelle to have reacted that way, you must have done something." But you automatically get labeled as the angry woman, and the punishment would be that much harsher on me than any of my counterparts.
Mhm. Mhm. I
And
mean,
that's what at least we have to contend with.
absolutely. And the multiple realities, right? Like our realities, right? In the world of different realities for other people, right? Different outcomes for other people. And that is, it's really, it messes with your mind, honestly, right?
Yes.
It's, I hate to like, bring it to the like more academic side, but it is that double consciousness, right? It is that kind of like you see yourself and then you see yourself how other people see you, and you're correcting, you're regulating, you're asimilando. You're just like, ooh, okay, déjame pensarlo, let me strategize around this, right? And there's so much extra work, right, that we have to do, but that also has outcomes. It has health outcomes, it has mental health outcomes, right? And so I am trying to like think through like, how do we as like Black Latinas survive a world in which we're both erased and invisibilized, right? And then become hyper visible, right? And then have all of these different stereotypes attached to us, right? And then we have to maneuver through a series, right, of different gauntlets. So how have you seen this? How do you move through this kind of world? How, like, what kinds of like herramientas, what tools are we giving to our young Latinas, Latinx, to move through the world? Because one thing about path making is that we're not making it ourselves, right? We're following one.
Mhm.
We're following one that has been carved out for us. And that's one thing that we can't forget. Because if we start to think that we're the only ones, or we're the first ones of anything, then we're really trying to like, invent the wheel, right? It's that remembering practice that someone has done before. But then how are you functioning to deal with all of these things that we're like bringing in?
Mhm. Yeah, I have to give a shout out to Martha, because I met Martha 40 years ago. I was a young thing, and I saw
Girl, you
her.
still a young thing, okay? Come on.
I saw her, on a stage, telling her story, speaking her truth, as an Afro Latina. And at that moment, it gave me agency to step forward as well. And I have done that with the young Latinas and Latinos and young African American brothers and sisters that have come behind me, because we have to do it. We have to, sometimes we got to go there. They're going to make assumptions on who we are no matter what. We play nicely, they're going to make assumptions. So sometimes it's like, you know what? F it. I'm just going to go there, and I'm going to put myself out there. But I started doing a lot of narrative writing. I'm a cultural anthropologist. And so I started doing a lot of narrative writing and storytelling. And these young women started finding me online, they reading my articles and reading my stories, and they were saying, "I'm Latina, I'm Afro-Latina, I'm Dominicana, and I saw your story," and it gave them automatically agency. It gave them voice. And so we have to pass it on. Martha sparked that for me. Thank you, Martha. I don't see you on the screen anymore, but thank you, Mujeres. and
And
it
you're
gave,
sparking it for somebody,
and I'm
right?
sparking it, and I'm sparking it for other folks. And so when I did my dissertation, for me, I wanted to write about my family because they're, my nieces, my great grandnieces, now I have a grandson. And so for me, it's like, we have to keep our story alive, because in this country, we get, what is it? When you put too much cream in the coffee, you don't get the coffee anymore. We get diluted, And so it's like, for me, it's like really, and that's why I have to constantly, uplift our voices through our arts and culture, because that's like a non-confrontational way for us to be in the world. People, they love our music, right? They love our food, they love our dancing. And it's a way for people to get to know who we are through our culture, through our identity, through our narratives, through our stories. So I wrote about, 4 generations of assimilation and acculturation, because my grandmother never assimilated. She was, one of these diehard Latinas, Dominicanas, that she wasn't going to speak English, even though she could speak English. And I saw my mother go through the process of assimilating and then coming back saying, wait a minute, I don't have to be this because this is who I am. And so I think that the more we educate ourselves and we educate others about we don't have to melt into this pot. That's a myth, the melting pot. That's, to retain who we are enriches the culture. It enriches the communities that we're in. And I want other people to know too. I want to know who you are from your own cultural perspective. I want to know what your traditions are, because that's how we're gonna fight this white supremacist, patriarchal, hierarchical, capitalistic society that is sucking us dry, right?
Yeah. And Sonia, you're making me think, about like, we're not less of who we are if we speak Spanish or don't speak Spanish. We're not less of who we are if we're not dancing bomba or plena, or we could do a pericoripiao, really really good or not. Like, we're not less of or more of what we are if we don't fit into the like standard tropes of who we are. We get to be who we are as a people, right? Who have survived 500 plus years of colonialism and still stand here with the pride of our ancestry, right? And that, I think, is like such an important part of what it means to stand in one's like Black Latinidad, right? And I know that there's many positions on it. People who are like, I don't care about the Latino part. I don't want to talk about that part because it comes with its own racism. It comes, you know what I mean? There's all these points, and all of those are valid, right? All of those are valid positions. We get to step into this identity that we have with whatever tools and capacity that we have with us. But yeah, what about you, Michelle, Deanna?
For me, I have to think back to when I was just coming out of residency, looking for my first job and being given that opportunity to get into the workforce. The person who was my letter of reference happened to be a medical assistant working for the medical director. I had been a medical student 10 years prior, and he remembered me. He pulled that woman out of the interview. He said, "You got to hire her. She's great." He had not seen me in 10 years, and he was my reference. She also taught me, sit at the table. You always sit at the table. If they don't want you at the table, let them tell you to sit somewhere else, but don't you make that choice for yourself. And that's something that I try to teach the students that I work with, and the young women that I work with, that I try to be that mentor for. I try to use my platform and my position to bring awareness to the discrimination that our patients face because they don't speak Spanish, because I'm sorry, they don't speak English, because they look different. There's sometimes this mistreatment, or they're dismissed, they're ignored. So I try to be that person to bring light to the issues, so we can bring about change.
Absolutely. And I think telling our own personal stories and leading from our lives' experiences and those of our beloveds is critical, right? And that starts that chain reaction of folks then feeling self empowered to tell their own story. And it's not about just like um, giving this whatever audience it might be all of your life's experiences, but affirming your existence in whichever way feels most comfortable for you, right? That still affirms your identity and who you are and what peoples you represent, and it also takes us out of textbooks, out of newspapers, out of the news, and it makes it real, right? Like in RJ, we've talked a lot about um, la operación, right? The forced sterilization and coerced sterilization of Puerto Rican women, right, from the 30s to the 70s, and it's a fact, right? It's a fact. Pero when I was at Latina Institute, we were in Florida, and we're doing an RJ Reproductive Justice 101 training, and we're going through the RJ timeline, and we get to this particular point, and there's an activist in the space, ¿verdad? Afro-Latina from Puerto Rico, an elder who was like, I've never told anyone this because it never came to mind, but that was my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And suddenly everyone stopped, right? It's like, oh, it was at one point, it was just a poster on the wall. And then it became someone's lived experience, and it became very real.
Mm-hmm.
And the invisibilization that we face in society is not only is it real because we've experienced it, but it's also by design, right? It is by design. From the right to, the patriarchy to white supremacy, it is by design. If we can be invisibilized enough to put us under the ambiguous Hispanic or Latino category, then maybe we go any which way, right? But when we change what the right is trying to accomplish, what those in power are trying to accomplish, right? What the cis hetero patriarchy is trying to accomplish, we're pushing back on the intentions who suppress and oppress our voices and our very existence.
Mm-hmm.
And how we're looking to change that trajectory and demand that our communities are seen, heard, and that the oppressions that have been faced are challenged, dismantled, and that we have our eyes and our mission always towards liberation.
Right. Absolutely. And I mean, there's some really exciting questions actually coming in the chat. I wanted to talk a little bit about the barriers that we're facing inside and outside of our communities. But I think you bring up, and we can talk about that in a little bit, but I think some of the things that are coming up here is really thinking about, for example, Afro-Latinas access to abortion, right? Abortion rights and Afro-Latina experiences in communities. In terms of like healthcare, that's a core, right, part of women's reproductive health. And Michelle, you brought up, maternal fetal mortality rates in the Black community. And so what are we looking like, right? When our actual health and lives are at stake? What does that look like for us?
It's really concerning that having access to care is becoming so difficult. Getting into the doctor's office is becoming so difficult. Getting access to see someone when you have a limited time frame, a limited window. If you're interested in getting an abortion, you have to figure out, okay, by when did you realize that you missed your period? Can you get into that appointment so you can get the care you need? And depending on where you're living, that time frame is very narrow. In New York, we're quite fortunate. We don't have those restrictions, but there may still be an issue with access to care depending on whether you have insurance or whether, if you don't have insurance, there is still help available, but there may be challenges getting in through the door. So that to me is very concerning. Are we going to be going back to doing, abortions in unsafe ways, going out of the country to get abortions that can really put someone's life at risk? That worries me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And also, oh, go ahead, Deanna. Also, not on the other side of that, being able to abdicate, for ourselves in terms of, our own reproductive rights and having children. With my first son, I was in long labor, and who I thought was my doctor was delivering another baby. So I had to get who was like on standby. And he's like, "You're taking too long. We're going to do a cesarean." And I'm like,
Wow.
"What?
Wow.
What?" And I was like, "No. Is the baby in danger? No. Am I in danger? No. We're not doing a cesarean. And if you don't want to be here, at this point, I didn't even want him delivering, my child." So when I got pregnant with my second son, this was at Kaiser, they're you're a little bit older. I was 34, and somehow they had determined that Ezra was a Down syndrome baby, and they recommended that I abort him because I already had a child.
Wow.
Yeah, and I'm like, what? So Ezra is not a Down syndrome baby. He is like a brilliant, 22-year-old, graduating from Vanderbilt, basketball, architecture, but just, as a young mother, if I would have listened to these white men doctors and their recommendation on how I handle my pregnancies, Ezra wouldn't be here. I don't know what would have happened if I would have went on and had a cesarean that I did not need. Right. So it's like we have to be able to use our intuition, our second sense. When it doesn't sound right, when it doesn't feel right, we have to go with it. And so many times these doctors want to make you feel that they are, playing God, and they know what's best for you and for your health and for your children's health. And so it happens on both sides.
Yeah. I mean, this advocacy, right? Like oftentimes it's like our own advocacy for ourselves in the moment. Sometimes, and I think we were talking about this the other day when we were chatting together. Sometimes in our communities, our mothers, our grandmothers, our tias, even our siblings are scared to speak up for themselves when they're facing medical malpractice, when they're facing, they're being like kind of pushed right into doing something they not feel comfortable with. I actually saw that myself in the medical clinic when I was an interpreter. A doctor just really flippant about a patient, a young Mexican woman who was pregnant, sent her to the hospital to deliver her baby, to do the C-section. She wasn't even like 26 weeks along, right? They were like, "Oh, you're in labor." She wasn't in labor. She wasn't, right? Like, and so we see, right, this, and that's just one example of millions that we know of, right? That we have heard about, and that even if we don't have the exact number data, we know it's happening, right? And that's the thing, is like knowing and owning our own truths, right? The ones that you can feel, right? To be able to witness someone else's, right, experience within that system, right? Within that matrix of medical care, of racism, of discrimination, of anti-immigrant sentiment, right? But there is that kind of moment of advocacy. And someone had asked a question about Afro-Latinas as part of the Black radical feminist womanist movement, right? These women who really forged the path for us. And I'm thinking right off the top of my head, I'm thinking about, some of the most well-known like luminaries in the kind of radical political movements of like the 60s and the 70s, and thinking about the Young Lords Party and how health was at the forefront of so much of what they were doing, right? And women were at the forefront of that, albeit invisibilized in many ways, right? And how in New York City, for example, there was a lot of Black women, Black Latinas, Black Puerto Rican women, and African American women who were participating in that movement, right? So we're not new to this, right? We are very much true to this like radical politics. But what's your take on it? What's your experience and knowledge about Black Latinas, Afro Latinas as part of this Black radical feminist and womanist movement?
Yeah, and also to underscore that abortion access was on the Young Lords platform. Okay, right? Right, this radical tradition, it is real, and it is felt and heard, the solidarity between the Young Lords and the Black Panther Party, and how folks moved together and built systems, when systems structures political education, community care, right? When the system, the existing infrastructure was not catering to our communities in an effective way, right? And this is the brilliant scholar and activist Dorothy Roberts speaks a lot to the racism, right, in healthcare, the racism that is designed intentionally, right, to prevent equitable care for our communities, right? The studies done that showed that Black and Latino folks, right? And they talk that she presents that data together. Didn't need as much when they went into ER. They were going into the hospital for pain, right? They did one. It was a study, in the 90s, I believe, pero it was about Black and Latino folks and then white folks going into the ER for a broken leg, I believe. I'll confirm that. And the fact that they were less likely to be given pain medicine. On one level, because of the assumption of addiction, and on the other level, because of the historical myth that Black and Latino folks can take more pain, right? Or the alleged propensity to lie about pain, right, and the level of pain. Right. And so these were practices, and Michelle, you can definitely speak to this more than I can. I'm just like reading, you're experiencing, right? But this is the reality that so many of the doctors still employ, right? This is like decades, centuries old myths, disproven myths that are still in practice today. I remember when it took me forever to get diagnosed with endometriosis because I was exaggerating my pain. They couldn't find anything that was wrong with me. Nada. Pues maybe it's appendicitis. Let's see. No. Maybe it's what else did they say? Oh, you have an ectopic pregnancy. I don't have an ectopic pregnancy. They tested me for everything. Right. And then finally it took a doctor of color to dig a little bit deeper and find that I had endometriosis. Wow. Michelle.
Yeah. I mean, they probably thought it was all in your head. They may not have said it, but they thought it was all in your head. You're making it up. And that's sad. The practices you were mentioning from the 90s of undertreating pain in the Black and Brown communities. What we're seeing now, the opioid epidemic, is because of that. So who were mostly being impacted now with the opioid epidemic? It was the white folks. It's still impacting the Black and Brown, but you see much higher rates because they were being given narcotics for pain management more freely,
Mm-hmm.
and you developed a dependency.
Right.
So that's part of what we're seeing now, the downfall of all those practices.
Yeah, I mean, I for one have gotten my wisdom teeth pulled. I got one in California. I got, you know, one half done. I got good drugs. You know what I'm saying? It was excellent. I couldn't recommend it more. So when I had to go get the other side, I was like, it's gonna be fine. I got the other side done in Michigan, and they gave me Tylenol. They said, "Have a nice day." I never. I was like, this is what the una uso. You know what I'm saying? Like, but you know, there is this real. You know, on the one hand, you're like, thank you for not getting me addicted to the opioids, but on the other hand, damn homie, I'm out here fighting for my life. You know what I'm saying? Like, but it is. I mean, I love this. Like Laura said, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare, right?
Yes.
I think also drives it home, right? The question of like health literacy, right? Our being able to advocate for ourselves and for others, right? And to that be deeply rooted in our identity politics is so critically important. I mean, there is the question of what this means for economy, for economics, and we were going to have someone else on the panel who couldn't join us, Michelle Holder, who has the book Afro-Latinos in the U.S. economy. So that would have been a whole other area of expertise that we're not prepared to talk about. But I do want to just shout that out as I ask us a question about policy, because the great Nancy Lopez is in the chat. Hey Nancy, Dr. Lopez has asked us an incredible question around the census, right? So the Office of Management and Budget. And so she's saying that the OMB census has recommended, right? Or what she's saying, let me just read it. So let me not paraphrase, because it's an intense question. What policy recommendation would you give the OMB health equity practitioners about intersectionality in data collection for health, justice, distribution of resources, and liberation, right? So she says, although race has a visual component, right? What we're looking at, the black don't crack on the screen clearly is the visual situation that's happening here, okay? People talking about their grandmothers, I can't believe it. When they're talking about cultural heritage, they have proposed to ask about race and ethnicity in one question, which she argues would nullify intersectional analysis of inequalities in health and housing, employment, education, versus being able to see race, ethnicity, gender, class, sexuality, and other systems of inequality, those intersections. So when you collapse it all into one question, you lose so much, right? So what recommendations would you have from your own areas of expertise? What would you have for the OMB? It's a hard question. Nancy?
Is it specific to collecting data? I mean, there's a lot in there. So like,
yeah, it's specifically about data. Like, so if someone, if the Office of Management Budget Census was going to say, you know, we're going to actually just ask one question, we're going to bring together cultural heritage and race and ethnicity into one question, right? We lose a lot. So what is it? Is it, do we have more questions? Do we get more, like, do you have any, like, I guess there's no one answer, but there's something, you know?
My recommendation as an educator and as a researcher is you need to hire us to do our own surveys and to collect our own data and to make meaning out of our own data. That's where you need to start.
Yeah, because where do you put the trigueños at? You know what I'm saying? Like, yo soy India. Where you put them? That's what you need. We need a cultural interpreter. You know what I'm saying? To be catching all of our community shenanigans, you know?
And, you know, and that, I mean, that's the importance of diversity. You know, everyone is just like, oh, you know, we want to count beans. You know, how many of these do we have? How many? No, representation matters. And, you know, all skin folk ain't kin folk. So you got to put the right people in the right places to do the work. You know, if the OMB, I don't know what their workforce looks like, but I'm sure it don't look like what we look like on the screen. So, you know, representation matters. You know, you have to start leadership. You know, that's where I started in this conversation. You know, we need to be in the leadership positions. We need to be in the decision-making positions, policy-making positions. You know, we need to not only be collecting our own data, but we are the ones to analyze it and make meaning out of it, because it's about our lived experiences as well. So if they're not starting there, they're missing the boat.
Yeah. Yeah.
That part, that
Yeah.
part. And for me, it's again, y'all, I believe it's all by design. Always. It's by design. The desire to, conflate everything, right? Minimizes this concept that of diversity, right? Minimizes the different lived experiences that we all have, right? So if you can just create this pan ethnicity, and don't have to pay attention to the different lived experiences, you can go forth with creating whatever policy you have and these blanket solutions that then are expected to meet the lived experiences and the needs of everyone equally, right? But what we know, what history tells us, is that, even in the reproductive justice fight, right? We had Roe v. Wade. Pero for poor Black and brown folks, Roe v. Wade was not enough. And it did not ensure access to everyone because folks didn't actually have access, perhaps in their communities. And if you had, depending on your insurance, right, you couldn't actually get access to care. Right? If you had Medicaid insurance, you couldn't get access to care depending on your zip code.
Mm-hmm.
So, folks wanted to laud Roe v. Wade, and absolutely, let's laud Roe v. Wade, but it was never enough for all of us. But we kept it as is and didn't fight all collectively until recently to dismantle the Hyde Amendment, right? We didn't fight on the same levels. We didn't acknowledge the barriers that exist in different states to accessing care. And therefore, right, it collapsed on some levels, on many levels, right? And what we're facing now is the criminalization of folks, right? So folks are being criminalized for having a miscarriage, depending on where you live,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that, again, is an opportunity for folks to paint the picture of these, of the people that are miscarrying or that are and they are committing crimes, right? Now they're committing crimes, right? And so when you're thinking about the census, right? And this idea of let's just have this one category, everybody just in there, right? It also provides an opportunity to the powers that be, to whichever party or whomever's in office, to say that, well, this element of intersectionality, diversity, different lived experiences, it doesn't exist. Because look at this data point, right? This data point is there's all these folks, they all identify as this. So there's other elements, they're not real.
Mm.
And then it opens the door, right, to creating a policy or creating systems that are one size fits all and will inherently leave many of us outside of access permanently.
Right.
My concern is such a narrow view of who we are as a people impacts how much resources we get. The census is used to really allocate resources, and the poorest communities are going to get less. We're not going to be able to offer more services. I am in the business of prevention. I believe if I can help you before you get ill, if I can work with you to eat healthier, be more active, and help prevent an illness, it will save the system money down the line because you will not become a burden with illnesses on the system. So, how can we not look at allocating more resources adequately so we can help save money down the line, because that's what we would like to do by keeping people healthier, working in their communities, being active. And for me, that's one of the biggest concerns.
Yeah,
Mhm.
no, that's incredible. Yeah, I mean, there's just such a deep tie within like our cultural practices to the state of our health, to then the impact that the law has on the law of the land has on us, right? And on our bodies and our lived experiences. And so then it kind of becomes this kind of like cycle in this circle, right? And so how do we advocate for ourselves? How do we liberate ourselves, right? So that now we're not always deeply entrenched in like the worst possible aspects of this. And I think it's not just like a question of like, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps and make sure you cook broccoli with your arroz con gandules. That's not it, right? Like, so that's not the point. But because it is not only our responsibility, we're in this larger kind of network, this social system, right? That both sees us and doesn't see us, that creates these like food deserts, right? That bring into to work in these low wage jobs, right? Where we can't afford, right? The exorbitant amount of groceries. Have y'all been buying groceries lately? It's wild out there. The
Yes.
streets are wild, okay? And so the prices are high. And one can imagine, if we're saying that from our position as professionals, etc. I can imagine my mother raising a family of four, in this moment in time, where she and my father were factory workers, right, making less than minimum wage. So it's like, we have to be capacious enough in our politics, in our generosity, in our love, to see all those sides, right? And I'm thinking about how do we move, and one of the questions here, from one of the viewers, Olga Chapman Rivera, is asking us, how can we build our institutions and spaces where we have the power to create from us and for us? How do we build those institutions? How have you worked within existing and also created institutions?
I think it's a both and. I think, with the institutions that we find ourselves in, we need to be changed because, in this country, every system, every institution is developed from, again, a white supremacist ideology and patriarchal ideology. And that's not how we work best. So, we have to either, change the culture, the system of the organizations that we're in, or we have to do our own thing. Again, shout out to Marta, because she has always done her own institutions, and the impact, has been amazing. When I came into the organization that I'm running now, almost 7 years ago now, I came into the organization with the intention of changing the system, changing the culture. So I'm not going to run this organization the way that it was run before me, because that doesn't work to elicit the type of impact and change that I want to see happen for the communities of BIPOC folk that I want to have an impact on. So I'm going to have to do things differently. And that's always gotten me in trouble in academia, because I've always been in positions, whether I'm in the classroom, whether I'm in an administrative position, where I'm not going to do it the way you do it. I have to do it the way I do it,
Right.
and I think, and we have to keep on, because it'll catch, it'll catch as long as we stay consistent, to our journeys and what we bring to the table. We may have to take a break, take a sabbatical here and there, and refuel ourselves, self-care, part of the liberation struggle. But, there are folks that are looking at what we're doing and how we're doing it. So I have, about 6 generations of students that I'm seeing now that are adults and that are developing the practices that I taught them, in the classroom way back when, and saying, Dr. Magnon, your class did this, and as a result, I'm doing this. So, yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
That's amazing. Oh, go ahead, Misha.
No, go ahead.
I was simply going to just echo your sentiments, Sonia, and note that it also use our power of presence, right? If we have a seat at a particular table, we have to make sure that that seat isn't just, you know, a seat where you're allowed to sit but not speak, right? You know, calladita te ves más bonita, no? But nah, that's not it. That's not it. It is about ensuring that that seat is actually a seat that will be heard, and then what you do is pull up another seat and bring your comadre to that seat, right? And I've been in policy spaces where they're just like, oh, and I talk about, you know, organizers or community members, and they're like, oh, but this is a policy conversation. They don't have to be here. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. The community members that are going to be most impacted by a particular policy don't need to have a say in it. Oh, so you know what everyone in this country needs? Fantastic. No, how about we have a conversation with community members where you have a listening session and actually learn what folks need. And I think that's for anyone who's listening. You have a seat, you you pull up another seat, and they pull up another seat, and that's how we start to fill that room.
Nice. I would say that for me, I've been trying to always work in institutions that have allowed me to do the work I need to do and have a similar mindset. I've been working in the public health system, in the public hospital system in New York for many years in many different roles, because that's where my community usually gets the care. And that's where I see that there's a interest in helping the community and do better for the community. Because if they do well by the patients, they're going to look better themselves as an institution. So I've been aligning myself in these institutions to make sure that I don't have to fight at every turn.
Right.
That I get the support that I need to help the patients that I'm working with and the communities I'm working with.
I love that. I mean, I want to share too, like, as we're talking about these strategies and building and going back to the question of like data. I remember my first, my first job was at Michigan State as a assistant professor. And the first year I went in there and, Jomaira Figueroa, like, bang. So they're like, okay, great. I'm in there. There's only one other Latina in the department. She's Chicana. We cool. It's great. The second year I come in, the top of the year, the department chair calls me in. And says, Jomaira, I'm looking at the statistics for the department. And last year there were 2 Latinas in the department, but this year there's only 1. Do you know where the missing Latina is? Right. And what had happened was that once I arrived to Michigan State and they saw me, they moved me out of the Latina category into the Black African American category. Right. And so I just thought it was just like the funniest thing that this, the chair of my department was asking me, where's the missing Latina? And I'm like, I'm literally sitting in your office. Like, here she is, right? But it was really, really instructive for me because I realized that I could run circles around these folks, that I could sit at every table, right? And that they wouldn't be able to tell the difference, right? Strategizing for me, it became about strategizing around the limits of the white imagination, right? Making moves and organizing around the limits of white supremacy, which are very many. And through that, beginning to build different initiatives, institutions, projects, laboratories, getting funding, going and listening to meetings, going to the Black faculty, and listening to how they talk to the Black faculty, going to the Latino faculty meeting and listening to the ways they talk about them, right? And then just being like, oh, this is really interesting. I'm gonna sit in all these rooms. I'm just gonna gather all this information and I'm gonna make moves and you have no idea, right? How to undo the things that I'm going to do, right? And for me, that became a strategy within academia, within the ivory tower, to try to, not necessarily in some ways do build my own thing outside of it, but also use all of the resources in that place, because many of the places that we're working are rich with resources, right? And for us to be able to use those resources to the benefit of our people, of our communities, right? Of their beautiful histories, languages, projects, right? Culture. And so for me, that is part of that practice. But it also has been the practice to think about like, what does Latina life, what do Latina lives, who counts among us, right? And how are we thinking about like our trans sisters, right? Afro-Latinas, Afro-Latin femmes, right? How do we ensure that they are also always already included in our conversation, not just as an additive to it, not just like, oh, them too, right? Pero where does that come into play, right? In the kinds of movement building and the path making that we want to engage in, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that is part of seeing ourselves as interconnected for our collective liberation, right? And ensuring that, you know, we're trying to get all of our siblings free, right? And that our trans siblings are part of that conversation, right? We have seen a number of trans folks murdered regularly, Afro-Latinx trans folks, and the organizations that are lifting up these attacks on trans and our communities are typically LGBTQ organizations, right? Or organizations like ours that are reproductive justice grounded in queer and trans liberation. And that it's setting folks aside, right? It's setting our trans siblings aside from the dominant narratives that some of the Latina organizations and some of those spaces that they've been able to come into, right? A couple of months ago, an Afro-Latina trans woman in Puerto Rico, in Carolina, was murdered, right? It was largely spoken about. It was in the news and things like that. But it was largely lifted up by LGBTQ organizations, right? By trans liberation organizations. The conversation was not really had by Latina organizations, right? And so this is like the long history and tradition of scapegoating folks, right? When you're working on any particular area. And unfortunately, in different spaces, it might be immigrants that get scapegoated, or it's, salud, or it's, trans folks that get scapegoated, right? And we have to, it's a call to action to remember that, again, Kimberly Crenshaw taught us about intersectionality and the multiple oppressions. And and our trans siblings, right? Our trans community, they're experiencing multiple oppressions. And I go back to bringing that seat, pulling up that seat, right? If we have a seat at the table, we have to bring up that seat and make sure that we bring all the chairs, right? We got to bring all the chairs, because we know they are disproportionately impacted, right? The trans Afro-Latina Chanel Perez Ortiz, right, was murdered, and the majority of Latina powerhouses didn't speak to it. Leilín Extravaganza Covilet Polanco was murdered in July 2019 in Rikers, right? She was arrested. She's 27, arrested, and forced to be in the male side, right? Forced to be there, and then forced into solitary confinement, where she had a seizure and died, right? And so then we're thinking about the police state, right? The prison industrial complex, and how they treat our communities, and how they treat folks that they want to make sure stay at the margins and aren't at the center of the conversation. And also, again, ensuring that folks are telling their own stories, right? And that they're creating their own stories, right? I think a number of Afro-Latina folks were really lifted up in the show Pose, right? And the many other programming and narrative work that's happening, that's putting folks' stories and these stories that have historically lived in the margins and bringing them to center. One of my colleagues shared with me that their friend, a Latina trans person, told them that they had printed Forward Together's Trans Day of Resilience art project zine, right? And that it actually helped them as they were going through a mental health crisis. Mm-hmm. And then they printed it and shared it with their children in Panama, a chosen family of young trans Afro-Latina folks, and they had seen nothing like it, right? It's a collection of stories, of poetry, of art that is affirming, and it's about ensuring that folks see themselves in the future, see themselves existing into the future and affirmed. And I think that, with reproductive justice, it's about bodily autonomy. It's about being able to raise our families in a safe and healthy environment. It's of course about abortion access, and the right to determine if and when you have a child, right. And that is why for us as a reproductive justice organization, trans and queer liberation are at the center when we're talking about our bodies.
Absolutely. And you bringing these names to this talk is so important, this conversation. And I'm thinking about the way that Puerto Ricans galvanized a few years ago around the murder of Alexa Negron Luciano in Puerto Rico, right? And how important that was and how shocking it was. But that since then there have been more murders, but there has been less coverage of those murders of our trans sisters and our trans siblings. And you talk about Kimberly Crenshaw and intersectionality, and it is also an apt time to bring in the Combahee River Collective, right, who talk about our oppressions as interlocking, right? They are locked in with one another, right? And for me, that becomes not just a method of thinking, but a mode of seeing, right? The ways they are locked in, right, together, that we cannot be pulled apart in our community through these things. And I think not only educating ourselves and advocating, but also talking to our families, talking to our elders, right, who are watching extremely conservative television, media, Telemundo, Univision, etc., right? And we go from the most marginalized, the periphery of the margin, to then also people who are in the limelight. I'm thinking about Coleman Domingo, who just got nominated for an Oscar, a queer, right, gay, Guatemalan, Belizean, Latino actor who all of the Hispanic arts, whatever, Telemundo, all those people, no one mentioned him, right? No one says look at this Black, gay, Latino icon, right? That has this, right? So you can imagine if at that level, right, we are being completely ignored, imagine our folks who are at the most vulnerable places. And so there's something to be said about using our own voices, right? And to be able to advocate and make these paths, right? To really talk about these lived realities that we have. We have just a few more minutes, so I would love to open it to some final thoughts from everybody. I want to thank everyone who's been in the comments and in the chat. We're seeing a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it. And we really appreciate it. But I just want to open this time for some final words from everyone, and thank you.
For me, thank you for inviting me into this forum. It was such an honor to get the invitation and to see so many fabulous Afro-Latinas doing such great work across the nation. So it is truly an honor to be among all of you. And it empowers me to continue doing the work that I'm trying to do and learn more and seek more information so I can read the reports that are coming out with information about the Afro-Latinos, that they are looking at the data and how can then I work with people so we can try to get more data available. So thank you for that.
Mm. Yeah, echo Michelle. Thank you for the invitation. Martha, you know, anytime you call, I'm gonna always say yes. My call to action from this is I know there's a website, and if our information, well, I'll speak for myself. Feel free to put my information, contact information, because I don't know who is in the audience who's been listening to this, but we need to come together. You know, when we see these, when we're a part of these conversations and we bear witness to these conversations, you know, we're excited, you know, we're rejuvenated, and then we go back to our own little corners of the world and struggle by ourselves. So my call to action is, you know, let's develop some partnerships, some collaborations. Let's continue the conversation offline. You know, let's get in touch with each other. You know, put my information on the website. I want to collaborate and partner and stay in touch with, you know, not only, you know, my hermanas that are in this conversation with me, but those of you that are out there bearing witness to this conversation as well.
Absolutely. I agree and echo everything shared. And, you know, I'm a movement strategist. Our organization is about building our movement. So for everyone.
Uh-oh.
Oh no, her computer was at 4%. Sorry, it died. The computer died.
I know.
But her bio is going to be posted on all the social media. Hopefully she can reconnect, bendito. But I know that the Absolutamente Negro will share. You see all the posts and you see where you can contact Diana. But I do want to take this opportunity as we're segueing. Oh, that little spiral, bendito. As we're segueing. I want to bring back Dr. Marta Moreno Vega to close us out. Really, thank you. And I just want to, as everyone here has said, thank you for creating and co-creating this space with all these amazing organizations, right? The Creative Justice Initiative, the Afro Latino Forum, you know, and you were able to like galvanize all of this support. It should not go unnoticed. The decades of like love and care and fuerza that you have put in to making sure that we stay in the light and connected to each other. So I just want to say that before I let you take the wheel. Okay.
Thank you. Well, thank you is not enough. Gracias is not enough. We're connected at the hip. So this is not the end. This is the continuum, right? So that it's exciting to see that the children we bear are doing the right job, you know? And as Sonia said, that's the point of doing what we do, right? Building forward. And I think that one of the things that comes out of this is that you began, the four of you, in conversation, right? With your wine and cheese, the imaginary wine and cheese, began to develop the narrative that will give us the action that we need. Because we can't keep using the same framework that's used against us. We need to use the framework and the language that sets us forward and sets us free. So the language that you brought to the table, the narrative that you brought to the table, absolutely connects us as family across all cultural borders, and absolutely sets the framework for the rest conversations. So this is not the end, this is the continuum. So thank you, my sisters, my daughters. Gracias. And you all can follow us at the Creative Justice Initiative website, and all of the information bios are there, and the next conversations are also listed and dates listed. So we hope to see you at all of the conversations. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for being with us. Bye. Have a good evening. And ladies, you kick ass.
Thank you.
Kick ass.